Last week, you had names like JSN, Saquon Barkley, Devon Achane, Garrett Wilson, Zay Flowers, and Joe Burrow help you win your matchups. Well, this week, I'm bringing you 10 players that will do the same. 10 players that will dominate in fantasy football in week 10. My hit rate through 9 weeks is 65%. Starting off with our first player in a game overseas in Deutschland, Tyrone Tracy is going to tear apart the Carolina Panthers. My RB16 on the week. This is the best matchup for running backs in fantasy football. And let's have a look at what's happened so far this year for the Carolina Panthers against the running back position. Chase Brown had his best day as a pro, 23 fantasy points. DeAndre Swift over 120 total yards, 20 fantasy points. Bijan Robinson, 2 tuds, 25 fantasy points. And then in the same game, Tyler Algier had a game as well, over 100 yards himself and a touchdown. And then Alvin Kamara 2 times this year, over 22 fantasy points. The Panthers defense, guys, in 2024, this isn't a joke, I'm serious. They give up the most rushing yards, total yards, and total points per game to opposing offenses. They are the only team in the NFL allowing over 30 points per game. And the Giants are 5.5 point favorites, which leads me to believe that they are likely going to be able to establish a run against the Carolina Panthers. And Tyrone has completely taken over this backfield in New York, even with a healthy Devin Singletary. He just needs to get more touches on the goal line. But check this out. Since week 5, he has about 70% of the snaps, about 60% of the rushing attempts, a 10% target share, and again, just 20% of the carries inside the 5-yard line. Imagine when they start to get on the goal line and use him a little bit more. I'm predicting at least 18 touches, 80 plus all-purpose yards, and 16 plus PPR points. He's going to dominate in Germany. All right, the people of Germany will know the name Tyrone Tracy. All right, the second player that's going to dominate this week, that is Brian Thomas Jr. versus the Vikings. Yes, coming off a bad week, we are going to bounce back this week versus the Vikings, the third best matchup for your wide receiver when you adjust for schedule. Check this out. This year, the Vikings, Jaden Reed, Garrett Wilson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown all had over 100 yards and a touchdown, all had over 25 PPR points, and then Puka Nacua recently coming back had 7 catches, 106 yards, and over 18 PPR points. The Vikings defense, you attack these guys through the air. You cannot run on them. Just last week, Jonathan Taylor was shut down with the run game. The Vikings defense this year are giving up the 5th most passing yards per game and the 2nd fewest rushing yards allowed per game. The Jags, by the way, are 4.5 point underdogs, which makes sense, but leads me to believe that they're going to be throwing the ball even into the 4th quarter. And quite frankly, this team needs Brian Thomas Jr. to be that guy every week if they have a shot at a win. Check this out. Christian Kirk is out for the year. Gabe Davis hasn't played because of a shoulder injury recently. Etienne and Tank Bigsby have been dealing with injuries all year, and they've been up and down. Brian is really one of the only positive spots on this team this year. He's actually 8th in receiving yards amongst wide receivers. As a rookie, I think he has at least 7 targets, 80 yards, and 15 plus PPR points. All right, this takes me to my spicy, hot, bold take of the week. This week, in week 10, both Deebo Samuel and Brock Purdy finished top 10 at their position in a huge day at Tampa Bay. Oh, but I'm not Dr. Seuss, all right? Don't get me writing some books now. All right, so for Deebo Samuel, this is the 5th best matchup for wide receivers. And for Brock Purdy, this is the 2nd best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. All right, in the last 2 weeks alone, the Bucs defense has given up 18 points to Darnell Mooney and 28 points to DeAndre Hopkins. 2 touchdowns, his best game in years. And since the year 2020, Deebo is averaging over 20 points per game without Brandon Ayuk in the lineup. I'll give it to you, it's a small sample size, but without Brandon Ayuk, he is him a thief, which is why I've been telling you guys to trade for him. And in the last 2 weeks, again, quarterbacks against the Bucs. Kirk Cousins, 4 tuds, 28 points. Pat Mahomes, 3 tuds, 24 points. I mean, you ever want to start Pat Mahomes the entire season and then he goes off against this defense? On the season, the Bucs defense is top 5 in passing yards, and total points allowed per game. This game is tied for the 2nd highest over-under of the week, 50.5 points. We should see a ton of fantasy points in this one. I'm predicting Deebo to have 100 plus all-purpose yards and at least 18 PPR points. And Brock Purdy is going to get up there around the 250 range and 2 passing touchdowns. Both are incredible starts. All right, from one pair of teammates to another for my 5th and 6th player here, Aaron Jones and TJ Hawkinson. There's enough for everybody to feast against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So check this out. The Jags, second best matchup for your running back and the sixth best matchup for your tight ends. Speaking about Aaron Jones in this matchup, the Jags defense this year, I mean, Dare Ogunbowale had 15 points in a TUD. Trey Sermon, as a spot start, had 18 points. Didn't perform well against any other team. DeAndre Swift had 22 points. Josh Jacobs averaged over 5 yards per clip, 125 yards and 25 fantasy points. Saquon Barkley just put up almost 200 yards against these guys. I mean, you got to start your running backs against the Jags. And against tight ends, here's what's happened recently. Cole Kmet had 2 TUDs and 24 points. Hunter Henry had 92 yards and 17 fantasy points, and Tucker Kraft had 78 yards and 17 fantasy points, around that range. And by the way, in TJ Hawkinson's first game back from the ACL tear, he had a 63 route participation rate. He had 12% of the targets, 19% of the air yards, and 25% of the end zone targets. Does that sound mediocre? Well, what if I told you he only played 45% of the snaps? I mean, this guy's going to be an integral part of this offense moving forward. And the Jags defense are top 3 in passing yards, and total points allowed per game to opposing offenses. And by the way, Vikings are tied for the 3rd highest implied team point total on the week, almost 4 touchdowns worth of points. I'm predicting Aaron Jones at least 18 touches, 100 plus all-purpose yards, and 17 PPR points. And for TJ Hawkinson, 7 targets and a mystery box. Who the hell knows? It's a tight end position, all right? Give me a damn break. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Tank Dell versus the Detroit Lions. My wide receiver 19 on the week. Detroit is the 4th best matchup for your wide receiver this year. And let's have a look at some guys who have dominated against this team. Okay, so Cooper Kupp did his thing in week 1, 32 points. Chris Godwin dominated versus most teams. How about Marvin Harrison? Marvin Harrison had a game against this team, almost 17.5 PPR points. Calvin Ridley's best game of the year came against the Detroit Lions. He had 143 yards. Yeah, Calvin Ridley did 22 fantasy points. And then Jade Reed last week, 113 yards and almost 17 points. The Lions defense this year gives up the 4th most passing yards per game. This is one of the highest over-unders of the week. 48.5 point over-under here. And the Texans are underdogs, so they should be throwing in the 4th quarter. They're 3.5 point dogs. And look, regardless of if Nico Collins plays or not, I want to start Tank Dell. Of course, if Nico Collins doesn't play, it gives you an even bigger reason to play Tank Dell. But Tank is really starting to find his form. Don't forget that Tank Dell suffered a serious injury to his leg, the same injury Tony Pollard dealt with as a Cowboy and Mark Andrews dealt with a year ago with the Ravens. And it took those guys a while to really find their form. So you can see here that he's kind of started to pick up his form recently. In 3 out of the last 4 weeks, he's had a great fantasy day, including week 9 versus the Jets, a tough matchup, 126 receiving yards. I think he'll get 7 catches, 80 yards, and 15 plus PPR points. All right, the 8th player we're starting with confidence. It was a bust game last week, but you've got to put him back into your lineup. I know most people will, but I just want to give you the extra confidence here. Johnny Taylor versus the Buffalo Bills. Bills are the 3rd best matchup for your running back. And recently this year, Dare Ogunbowale had 15 points against them. Breece Hall had 21 points. He had probably one of his best rushing days, 6.3 yards per clip. And Devon Achane has had 2 games with 32 fantasy points or more. The Bills defense, by the way, right now is giving up the 7th highest yards per carry to opposing offenses. Last week for Jonathan Taylor, with Joe Flacco as a starter for the first time he's played, here's the bad news. 8.9 fantasy points. Now, here's the good news. He had a season high 5 targets. The reality is, with no Anthony Richardson, Joe Flacco is going to dump the ball off much, much more when he's in trouble. That is great news for Jonathan Taylor in PPR formats. I think he touches the ball at least 20 times, has 90 plus all-purpose yards, a touchdown, and 18 plus PPR points. All right, the 9th player we're starting with confidence. Look, I know it's been bad, guys, but I just believe things are going to turn around. I refuse to believe that this is what we're going to see out of Tyreek Hill. I think he's going to be a great play moving forward. The Rams are middle of the pack against wide receivers. Now, they did just lose Tre'Davious White. How much does that matter? I don't know. I thought the guy was washed, but they lost a cornerback, okay? And in the last 2 weeks, the Rams defense have given up 115 yards, 19 points to Justin Jefferson. And last week, Jackson Smith and Himba, as we call him, all right, had a career day, 180 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns, 37 fantasy points. This game right now is tied for the 2nd highest over-under of the week with the Niners and Bucks matchup. Should see a ton of fantasy points in this one. Again, 50.5 points. I just refuse to believe that Mike McDaniel is not going to use the best weapon in the NFL. I refuse to believe that this is their game plan. So I think it bounces back this week. 7 catches, 90 yards, and a touchdown, at least 22 PPR points. I'm being very aggressive with him in this video. And the last player today, let's talk about DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift has been on this video a lot this year, actually. I mean, he's just been in a stretch of very good matchups. And this is one of the last good matchups for DeAndre Swift. If you own him, I would be advising to sell him after this game. Don't want to play him in the playoffs with the matchups that he has upcoming. But this one's versus the Patriots. 5th best matchup for your running back. Jordan Mason, a long time ago, had 5 yards per clip, 160 yards, and 24 fantasy points. Joe Mixon averaged almost 8 yards per carry. Then Dameon Pierce came in garbage time and averaged almost 10 yards per carry. Tank Bigsby had his best day as a pro, 2 tuds. Tony Pollard had 4.6 yards per clip, 18 fantasy points. The Bears, by the way, 6.5-point favorites in this game, which is very favorable for DeAndre Swift. We anticipate this team being able to establish the run. And I'm predicting at least 20 touches, 90 plus all-purpose yards, and 17 plus PPR points. I appreciate y'all for watching the video. Do me a favor, hit that like button to show some love. Subscribe if you like the content. And the last thing I'll say here, if you don't have a free account on Flock Fantasy just yet, I mean, it's completely free when you use our promo code LAND at signup, LAND. When you sign up for a free account with our promo code, you'll get the My Team feature for free, the Expert Consensus Rankings for free, and the trade calculator all for free as a thank you. Last thing I'll say here is if you have a tough start-sit question or a trade question you want to ask, check out the pinned comment. We are replying to questions on our website. Hold up. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.